Good afternoon. Getting a little bit of a late start here today to post this video. Usually we do it right after the service. We've met again outside at church and are planning to continue meeting outside church moving forward here every Sunday, as long as we stay in the green and it's safe. I did mention to some other folks while we were there that we will, if we need to, move inside. We'll make arrangements in there to be able to be appropriately distanced, and masks will be recommended if we do move inside. But we're hoping to not have to do that too often over the summer here. The weather will hopefully be nice and not too hot, and certainly perhaps not raining and pouring and all of those things. So we are planning to continue meeting and looking forward to that instead of the Zoom meetings that we've been doing. But I also wanted to continue to offer these recorded messages for those of you who aren't able to make it for a variety of reasons. And so it is an opportunity just to sort of extend the reach of what we're doing here at Windermere. And the other reason that I'm late is we stayed a little bit longer today because I'm celebrating 20 years this summer of being at Windermere Heights as the pastor. And a lot has changed over those years, myself included. Not the same person that I was when I was 33 years old and arrived here, and I'm now 53. And wow, it is quite a long time. So it was a neat, so kind of surprised. They had a banner, we had some cake afterward, and yeah, so thank you to those of you from Windermere who saw that done and joined us today in that celebration. But it did mean that I was a little bit late getting back home, and then late to get to this video. But I did want to share it. And we talked this morning, as we've been talking through all of this, the ways in which our faith plays itself out in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of the tensions that we're experiencing over racial issues in our country. And there's a lot going on. But anyway, I was reading this past week about the Higgs boson particle. Some of you might be familiar with that, some have not. There's kind of a running joke at my house. I have sort of a fascination with physics and some of that stuff. I'm not very good at it. The math was horrible for me in high school and things. But I've always fascinated by the concepts and some of the implications. But so I was reading about this physics and about this particle, and it's a relatively recent discovery, and it was big news a while ago in the world of physics. Now, I still don't really understand exactly why it is such a big deal, but as I was reading about it, there were a couple of things that stood out to me, that struck me about the article that I thought were worth mentioning and talking about this morning. First, this particle apparently is very central to the understanding of physics, and to understand physics is sort of to understand the world and how it works. Like I said, it's kind of a running joke at my house. I said everything's physics, and everything reduces to that. And but anyway, this so important is this that some have dubbed this particle the God particle. Second thing that struck out is that many physicists actually believed in the existence of this particle long before its existence was actually observed. And I believe it was observed about 10 years ago in the Large Hadron Collider. It's over in Switzerland, I believe, or around there. But apparently, scientists had postulated the existence of this particle for a very long time, because its existence, if it existed, and it allowed them to make sense of things in their field that would otherwise not make sense. And it was just this particle, if it existed, a whole lot of things came together. And so they believed in what they could not see because of what they could see. And it all makes a lot of sense to Christians, right? Who argue regularly that we believe in a God that we cannot see because of what we can see. Now, I can hear it in some people already kind of rising up. And if you're following what I'm saying, and people might want to conclude, well, see, even science operates on faith. But I kind of want to put the brakes on that line of thought here, and instead of feeling affirmed or vindicated, I would like us to step back and ask some different questions, some hard questions about our faith and how it's expressed and how it's experienced by others. You see, the scientists who eventually went on to demonstrate that the Higgs-boson particle actually did exist lived for a while as though it existed even before they could prove it or know it, because the things that they did observe only made sense if a particle like this existed. So they operated, they lived, did their science as though it was there, and eventually they were able to prove that it was there, that it was a real thing. As Christians, I think we have to start asking ourselves if our understanding of the world necessitates the existence of God at all. Now, I'm not talking about something like scientifically here. There's, of course, a lot that has been written on that subject, science and faith at that level. And similarly, in regard to the existence of morals and ethics and the necessity of a God and so on and so forth. But today what I'm asking is simpler. If our day-to-day lives are lived in such a way that the existence of God would have to be assumed as necessary reality for understanding our choices and behaviors as Christians, as followers of Jesus. Or asked another way, when people who don't believe in God, in the God we say we believe in and trust, or if they observe our lives, are they able to make sense of our lives without regard to our professed faith in this God? And my sense is that day in and day out, our existence, or the existence or non-existence of God, plays very little, if any, role in our daily lives and choices, as I think we're seeing played out in real time right now in our circumstances. Most of us tend to see the world and move in the world according to our own celebrated independence from being told by anyone or any outside influence how we should think or act. We think we're our own people. We've made ourselves the center. And if we align with others, which we do, it's an alignment or an allying that we choose voluntarily to enter into. And that choice is shaped by our individual sense of what is right and good. And it's way more likely that I am going to be identified by others by my political affiliation than my faith. What people assume is primary about our identity is not usually our faith. And why is that? I know there's no simple answer, and some of that assumption might be a little bit unfair, and it could be cleared up when we get to know someone better or when they get to know us a little bit better. But the questions, those questions still kind of hang there. Do people look at my life and too easily make sense of it in terms other than the commitment I have to Jesus and his kingdom? And try as I might, I have to confess, I'm often as guilty as the next person here. And another part of this equation, of this question, well, what would it look like to be identified with Jesus? What would it look like for people to be able to look into my life and begin to see that's the shaper of who I am and how I decide and how I live? And that question is a great question as well, even if it's a bit unfortunate. And it's unfortunate because I think what it ends up uncovering is what a shallow understanding we tend to have of the gospel of Jesus, that has been reduced to a simple, my sins are forgiven and I can go to heaven when I die someday kind of thing. And after that, many people don't see how the gospel can or should affect how we live our daily lives. We seem to be left on our own to figure out what exactly daily living looks like as people who have received and are living out the good news of Jesus in our lives. And so interestingly, this was a similar problem to the one that the Corinthian church was facing. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 and 2, kind of lays out the problem pretty clearly. In verse 1, he says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you, or more accurately, I want to explain to you the gospel that I've preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand." Leon Morris, a New Testament scholar, contends that this is sort of a gentle rebuke to the Corinthians, who were evidently far from appreciating or understanding what the gospel really meant for how the Corinthians were actually living. They were taking a stand on it. They understood it as fundamental to their faith, but they were not really understanding how or what it would mean for them. And I think this is where a lot of us stand. We know and trust that the whole idea of the gospel matters and is central, even foundational to our faith, but we aren't exactly sure why. And we're not exactly sure how or what difference it should make in how we live our lives daily. Paul goes on in verse 2 then, "By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain." Now, I think this verse also needs some paraphrasing for us to sort of get our heads around it correctly. And if I'm understanding the scholars who are writing about this and what they're trying to say, I think it more clearly reads something like this. This gospel works the way it's supposed to if you are understanding it correctly, the way I'm trying to explain it to you. If you don't, if you keep on the way you've been, your believing makes no difference to you or others. Leon Morris again explains that believing in vain means something like believing without due consideration or in a haphazard manner. And he goes on to conclude, if people profess to believe the gospel but have not given due consideration to what that implies and what it demands, they do not really trust Christ. Their belief is groundless and empty. They lack saving faith. Now, that's a pretty strong conclusion, but it's there in the scriptures. And they lack saving faith, and I think this is important to understand, not because it is withheld from them, but because they simply do not take hold of it. They don't enter into it. And that's kind of the description. It's not a threat that Paul is making. It's a description of a reality. So however you want to think about the action that is to be taken and isn't taken and how that results in a lack of saving faith, I think it's a lot like Sheldon in The Big Bang Theory. If you're Big Bang Theory fans, you know he wants to learn how to swim, but he refuses to get into the water. And the reality is you can't learn to swim unless you get into the water. And I think that's essentially the same kind of thing that Paul was saying here. If you don't really believe and understand and enter into the gospel, then whatever you say you believe, if it's not showing itself up in how you live, it's in vain. It's not helpful. And so this is an important, and it's a big claim that's being made here in 1 Corinthians. So as we celebrate Independence Day this weekend, one of the things that I've learned is that our sense of independence extends far deeper than a political declaration of a sovereign nation. But rather, independence is deeply rooted in us as individuals who find it very difficult to trust anyone fully, even when that anyone is Jesus. But we have every reason to trust Jesus. We have every reason to trust this God who became one of us to save us by dying to show us that love is a power greater than death, that love conquers death and brings life. Paul's explaining this all the way through 1 Corinthians chapter 15, arguably even more through the book. But in 1 Corinthians 15, which we didn't read the entirety of today, Paul is making this argument about the love of this God, or the power of this God through his death and resurrection. And he's pointing out how central resurrection is to our faith. I mean, he goes so far as to say, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then all of this faith stuff is pointless. But if he did rise from the dead, and we believe that he did, we need to think very differently about the world and our place in it and our responsibility to it. And so in verses 33 and 34, Paul says, Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Come back to your senses as you ought, and stop sinning. For there are some who are ignorant of God, and I say this to your shame. And what he means here is that if you're surrounded by people who do not understand the gospel, who do not trust the resurrection, you are likely to become less like Jesus and not more like Jesus. You have to think differently. And only as we begin to think differently are we going to begin acting differently. Acting like Jesus. Loving like Jesus. And this is what the Corinthians were not doing. And as a result, they were not making Jesus known as the God who loves and cares for all. They were not distinguishable in their behavior and attitude from their surrounding culture. There was nothing that marked them as people who put their faith and trust in the crucified and risen God who turned the world on its head. Friends, this is a danger for us as well. This is exactly the kind of danger that we're facing. We're not to simply arrive at church or watch a video online to learn about Jesus, but we're to learn to represent him well to the world. And when our thinking and our acting is shaped by anything other than Jesus through his Spirit, we are likely veering off course and representing ourselves, representing our politics or our social class, or something other than Jesus. And those who don't know Jesus then won't be able to really know him through God, or know God through us as God intended. Because that's the way that he set it up. People in our relationship with God and how God treats us and how we understand and live in that relationship is supposed to help other people see that this God can be trusted, that this is a God who is for humans, not against them, not battling and warring against them. Whatever battle or war that God wages, it is for human beings. It is for their rescue, for their flourishing. God is not against anyone. He is for all of us. For God so loved the world, John 3:16 says, that he gave his only son. Now, I can't really, I don't think, say strongly enough that we have before us right now, in our current set of circumstances, great opportunities to represent Jesus well in the world by selflessly caring for the well-being of others, by doing something as simple as wearing a mask in public. We have the opportunity to represent Jesus well by loving our black brothers and sisters as ourselves and seeking their safety and well-being and flourishing as diligently as we would seek it for ourselves and our families. But to do this well is going to certainly mean some small sacrifices and maybe even some large sacrifices. Will need to be made by us to keep others safe and to see justice done for all. One of the things that I've heard over and over again through the years is that we need to honor those who sacrificed themselves for our freedoms. We need to honor those who did not consider their own sacrifice too great to secure safety and freedom for us today. And yet when the time comes for us, not just as citizens or even primarily as citizens of the United States, but as followers of Jesus, as his dearly loved children, to do as Jesus asked us to do and to take up our cross and follow him for the sake of others, we become far too reticent to make the smallest of sacrifices for our fellow human beings' safety, well-being, and flourishing. A far lesser sacrifice than many of our forebears had to make, and nothing compared to what Jesus sacrificed to bring life to us as an entire human race. Wearing a mask is not an infringement of my rights. It is an act of kindness and concern. Demanding equal rights and protections for our black brothers and sisters is not an unreasonable expectation for those who say that Jesus died and was raised so that all could have life and have it more abundantly. These are the kinds of things that when we do them will mark us as people of God, revealing his kingdom rule that is for the flourishing of all people. Independence Day was inaugurated as celebration of the overthrow of a tyrannical ruler and the establishment of liberty and justice for all, because of a belief that all humans are created equal by this God, that as Christians we are to represent that God. As Christians, then, when those ideals are compromised and that God misrepresented, it is our responsibility to declare that our primary allegiance is to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who lived and died and was raised again to show us that all nations are ultimately under God, and our trust and allegiance must be properly placed in him and lived out accordingly. So friends, I want to close with the paraphrase of verse 2 that I shared earlier in this message. This gospel works the way it is supposed to, if you're understanding it correctly, the way I'm trying to explain it to you. If you don't, if you keep on the way you have been, your believing makes no difference to you or others. We need to have our believing make a difference in how we live and what we do. And it's important to remember that while grace is offered and not dependent on works, grace is what is given so that we can join God in the remaking of the world. And with love and grace, we need to start holding each other accountable to having our believing truly make a difference to others and ourselves in our actual living. So I pray that these words that maybe in some sense you're tired of hearing from various quarters, I'm not the only person saying these kinds of things, but this is who we're supposed to be as followers of Jesus. So if you name that name, then we need to stop taking that name in vain. And we need to take that name upon ourselves as followers of Jesus, Christians, little Christs, if you will. And we need to take that seriously enough to represent him well, which in large measure is selflessly. And we need to start loving unconditionally. This is who he is, and this is who we are to be. So may you have the wisdom and courage to begin discerning what that's going to look like in your life. And may you find a community that will start to hold you accountable and that you will hold accountable to live closer towards this ideal. Our God will walk with us. He will offer us grace and forgiveness. There will be highs and lows. There will be successes and failures. But we need to continue to press forward to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus has taken hold of us. I love you all, and I hope that you had a great weekend and that your summer will continue to unfold in ways that we hopefully will see a relenting of some of what seems to just be piling on in 2020. But again, may we know the power and grace of this God who is ever present and walking with us. Be well.